All right. Hi, guys. It's Willing Away, and welcome to the episode covering Mesa Verde. I did not expect Mesa Verde to have as much history as it does have. So, this is kind of why we're late. There's 20 pages we're going to have to get through of kind of like research and stuff I thought was important that we should know about Mesa Verde. So, it's going to be a pretty long episode. We'll be covering Mesa Verde. And the reason I wanted to cover Mesa Verde was because last week, even though I'm a little late to the party, was Rock Your Mocks week, which is where people of Native American descent post and like show off their moccasins and stuff like that. And I thought, let's go to a national park that has, Native American history. And I was looking some up, and I was looking for one, and Mesa Verde popped up. And so that is why we're covering Mesa Verde today. I finally got the time to actually sit down and record. So here it is. After 3 days late, we're now here. Another thing that's going to be changing is we'll be changing the release dates for Friday. So Friday is just going to move to Saturday. So it's going to go Tuesday and then Saturday release dates for the podcast, just so that I have equal amount of time to research both parks. And that's just about it. I just want to have enough time to be able to research the parks fully so that you guys can get the best understanding of these parks. So let's just hop on right in because we got a lot to get through. So the overall information for Mesa Verde, this is just kind of like if you want to know a really quick, piece of what Mesa Verde is. So Mesa Verde is a national park, obviously, and it is located in Montezuma County in Colorado. It is classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The park protects some of the best preserved ancestral Puebloan archaeological sites, and Congress and President Theodore Roosevelt established the park in 1906. So the park has 52,485 acres and located near the Four Corners region in the southwest. It has 5,000 sites, which include 600 cliff dwellings, which makes it the largest archaeological preserve in the U.S. Mesa Verde, the name itself, is Spanish for Green Table. It is also called Green Table Mountains, and it is best known for the Cliff Palace, which is said and believed to be the largest cliff dwelling in North America. So back in the 7,500 BC, Mesa Verde was seasonally inhabited by a group of Paleo-Indians known as the Foothills Mountain Complex. So seasonally just means that they weren't there year-round. So certain seasons they'd inhabit Mesa Verde. So the variety of projectile points is what they called them, but looking them up, they're kind of like arrowheads. Think of it like the tip of a throwing spear, or just arrowheads. So the variety of projectile points that were found in the park indicate that they were influenced by the surrounding areas. These include the Great Basin, the San Juan Basin, and the Rio Grande Valley. Later, archaic people would establish semi-permanent rock shelters in and around the mesa. And in 1000 BC, the basket maker culture emerged from the local population, and by 750 AD, the ancestral Puebloans had developed from the basket maker culture. So the Pueblo people survived by mainly hunting, gathering, and subsistence farming of crops. They would grow what is called the Three Sisters, which is your corn, beans, and squash. The Mesa's first pueblos were built sometime after 650, and by the end of the 12th century, they started to construct the bigger cliff dwellings for which the park is best known for. By 1285, 1285, following a period of social and environmental instability, along with a period of prolonged drought, they abandoned the area and moved to locations in Arizona, New Mexico. These would include the Rio Cama, the Albuquerque Basin, the Puerto Plateau, and the foot of the Sangria de Cristo Mountains. And that's kind of all the overall info you have to know. So they did leave after a certain point. They stopped inhabiting Mesa Verde, and they went off to different areas, so your Arizona and New Mexico, which is we're going to have a section where people rediscover some of these cliff dwellings, because at the time no one knew they were there, because no one was really inhabiting the cliff dwellings. So this is where we're going to get into probably the longest. This is kind of the history, but it's more focusing on the inhabitants of the area, because that is the history of this area, is the inhabitants, the people who live there. That is the history that we have. So we're going to start off with the first era, which is your Paleo-Indians. So the first occupants of the Mesa Verde region, which spans from southeast Utah to northwestern New Mexico, that is the Mesa Verde region, right? Mesa Verde Park is in Colorado. Mesa Verde region covers everything from, southwest or southeastern Utah to northwestern New Mexico. So the first occupants were nomadic Paleo-Indians who arrived there in 9,500 BC. They would follow herds of big game, and they would camp near rivers and streams. Many of those eventually did dry up due to glaciers that once covered the San Juan Mountains. They would start to recede, thus drying up those rivers and streams. So the earliest group was the Clovis culture, which I believe we heard about this in potentially Big Bend or Yellowstone. I can't remember, but they were mentioned before. And the Folsom tradition. They were defined largely by how they would fashion their projectile points, so like your arrows, that kind of stuff. They did leave evidence of their presence. However, there is very little indication that they lived in the Mesa Verde during this time. There's not too much. They did leave evidence, but it's not a lot to, There's very little indication that they were there. So after 9,600 BC, the area started to get warmer and drier, which caused your pine forests to start to grow, and animals that lived in those forests to start to appear, like inhabit the area. So Paleo-Indians started to inhabit the mesa in increasing numbers before 7,500 BC. However, it is unclear, as I've stated earlier, whether they were seasonal or they were year-round residents. Nobody really knows. It's kind of left up to, the evidence we do have. So it's kind of undecided or unclear whether they just stayed there for a couple seasons out of the year or if they were year-round. So the development of the throwing spear, which has an actual name called an atlatl, A-T-L-A-T-L. That is its name, and that's what I'll be calling it if I can pronounce it really well for the rest of this. But an atlatl was developed, and that made it easier for them to hunt their smaller game. And it was considered a crucial advance at the time, because bigger game had started to disappear from the region, so they needed a way to be able to hunt those smaller animals way easier, and the atlatl allowed that to happen. So it was considered a crucial development at the time. That kind of ends our Paleo-Indian era, and now we get into the Archaic period. So 6,000 BC is the beginning of what is considered the Archaic period in North America. So a lot of archaeologists differ as to what the origin of the Mesa Verde Archaic population is, but some believe that they developed exclusively from the local Paleo-Indians that had lived there at the time. So the Archaic people developed, they probably developed locally. That's what that's what some of them, think, that they developed locally. But they were influenced by contact, trade, and intermarriage with other people from outlying areas. So the early Archaic people who lived near the Mesa Verde utilized the atlatl, the throwing spear, and harvested a wide variety of plants and animals than the Paleo-Indians had, while retaining their primarily nomadic lifestyle. So they inhabited the outlying areas of Mesa Verde region, but they also inhabited the mountains and the mesa tops and the canyons of the area. So these areas are where they would start to create their rock shelters and their rock art, and that would leave evidence of animal processing and what is called chert napping. And I had to look this up. So chert is a rock. It's a type of stone, kind of like a mineral. And napping, K-N-A-P-P-I-N-G, napping, I think that's how you spell it, means shaping of the rock. So when you would, I've seen these on like TikTok before, but where they'll hit the obsidian and it'll start to carve out like arrowheads, which is kind of what it is. It's most commonly like an arrowhead. And that's kind of what they would do. So it left evidence of this creation around. So environmental stability during the period led to a lot more population expansion and migration. So a lot more people started to live there. And from 5,000 to 2,500, major warming and drying led the archaic people to seek the cooler climate of the Mesa Verde. So what would happen, and we're going to get this a little into the climate, so the Mesa's higher elevations would bring in snowpack, which would then combine with your spring rains, and that would provide plentiful amounts of water. So you would have your spring rains, and then you'd have your winter snowpacks, and so you kind of all year round had a source of water. And so that's kind of why that they lived there, because it was kind of guaranteed that you would find water. So by the late Archaic period, more people were living in the semi-permanent rock shelters, and they would also preserve perishable goods, such as your baskets, your sandals, and your mats. They also started during this time to make a variety of twig figurines, which I thought were cool. Many of these usually resembled like your sheep or your deer. And then later in this period, it was also marked by increased trade in exotic materials, such as your obsidian and turquoise. We did find out in Yellowstone that there was, I believe it was obsidian that was getting traded really far from where Yellowstone was. So I don't know, I'd have to look at it, but maybe this is the obsidian. Who knows? So marine shells and abalone from the Pacific coast found their way to Mesa Verde from Arizona, and the inhabitants at the time would make them into necklaces and pendants. So at this time, rock art flourished, and people tended to live in rudimentary houses made out of mud and wood. So their attempts at plant domestication eventually worked, and they would eventually develop into a sustained agricultural and then by doing this, that marked the end of the Archaic period, a little bit before 1000 BC. Now we get into our third era. So our third era is called the basket maker culture. So with the introduction of corn and sustained agriculture by the 1000 BC, the trend went away from nomadism and toward permanent pit house settlements, which meant that the archaic Puebloan transitioned into what is now called the basket maker culture. So basket maker has, I believe 3 eras to it as well. So I didn't see too much about basket maker culture 1, but I did see quite a lot about basket maker culture 2, which is era 2. So basket maker 2 people are characterized by their farming and foraging skills, the use of the atlatl, and the creation of woven baskets in the absence of earthen pottery. By 300, corn was the permanent staple of the basket makers' people's diet, which relied less and less on wild food sources and more on their domesticated crops to survive. So they would also fashion a variety of household items. This would include stuff made from plant or animal materials, stuff like sandals, robes, pouches, mats, blankets, clay pipes, and even gaming pieces. So basket maker men, getting into this word, they were relatively shorter and more muscular. Most averaged less than 5.5 feet tall. It's crazy to think I'm taller than them. But they would usually be under a little bit of 5.5 feet tall. So their skeletal remains showed that they were going through very hard labor, extensive travel. This also included degenerative joint disease, healed fractures, and moderate anemia, which is associated with that's your iron deficiency. So when you stand up and you get dizzy. So but yeah, so their skeletal remains showed that they were living a very hard labor life, a lot of work and stuff like that. So another thing about them is that they would bury their dead near or amongst their settlements and would often include luxury items as gifts, which could indicate differences in like relative social status. They were known for their rock art throughout the park, which tends to depict animals and people, both in abstract and more realistic forms. Some would either be single works, like one animal or something like that, or very elaborate pieces. A very common subject at the time that was put into this rock art was a hunchbacked flute player that the Hopi, which is a Native American tribe, would call the, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce this, Kokpili. But I looked at it and it looks kind of cool. It's like kind of looks like a little bird, or like that's what I saw from it. It looked like a little bird, but it does play the flute. But by 500 AD, the atlatl was replaced by the bow and arrow, and baskets were being replaced by pottery. This would like mark the end of Basket Maker 2 era, and then it would start Basket Maker 3 era. So just by changing from the atlatl, which is the throwing spear, to the bow and arrow, and baskets to pottery, we got a new era. So now we're talking about Basket Maker 3 era. So obviously pottery starts to be developed, which would include, ceramic vessels. These were considered a major improvement, and it also allowed that pottery protects seeds against like molds, insects, and rodents. And so these pots and ceramic vessels were great because you didn't have to worry about that stuff. So by 600, they started to use your clay pots to cook soups and stews. And then at this time, as we had known before, they were considered seasonal. They would live kind of seasonally. Year-round settlements started to appear around this time. So people were starting to actually start living here for the whole year. So the San Juan Basin population increased a lot after 575, when there was very few Basket Maker 3 sites. And by the early 7th century, there were many sites in the mesa. So the next 150 years, villages would tend to consist of small groups, tend to be like 1 to 2, 3 residents at a time in these villages. The population for the Mesa Verde before 675 was approximately 1,000 to 1,500 people. Beans and new types of corns were eventually introduced a little bit before 700, and by 775, some of these settlements that we were talking about earlier had started to be able to accommodate more than 100 people at a time. So this started the construction of your large, really like above ground storage buildings so that you could store stuff. And basket makers would store enough food for at least 1 year at a time. And they made that so that if they needed to, they could quickly relocate their dwellings. So they would just store enough for a year, and if it was absolutely needed to, they would be able to relocate fast enough if they needed. That was kind of how they would set up their storage. So by the end of the 8th century, the smaller hamlets were eventually supplanted by larger ones that saw continuous occupation for, it said like at least 2 generations. Eventually, basket makers, 3 people would establish a tradition of holding large ceremonial gatherings near community pit structures, and this is kind of where we start to end Basket Maker 3 era. So now we get into it was a section called Ancestral Puebloans, and you start off with Pueblo 1, which marked from 750 to 900. So 750 marks the end of your Basket Maker 3 era. That is over with. Now we move into the start of the Pueblo 1 period. This period or era is categorized by like major changes in, instead of like your pots and your food, stuff like that, or the weapons you use, this was categorized by the way they changed the designs and constructions of their buildings and the organization of household activities. This is what changed this era. So Pueblo 1 people doubled their capacity for food storage from 1 year to 2, and then they built interconnected year-round residencies called pueblos. So house activities, which had been reserved for subterranean pit houses, were moved to above ground dwellings. This altered the function of pit houses from all-purpose spaces to simply just community ceremonies. They were used mainly for community ceremonies. After that, however, they do continue to use their large houses for their extended families, and that was particularly during the winter months. So during the late 8th century, Puebloans began building square pits. These structures would eventually be called by archaeologists, they would be called proto-kivas, and they were typically 3 to 4 feet deep and 12 to 20 feet wide. And after that, the first pueblos would begin to appear at Mesa Verde sometime after 650. By 850, more than half of Pueblo people lived in them. So Puebloans found it difficult to survive on the hunting and foraging and gardening, which made them really reliant on this domesticated corn structure that they had going. So they couldn't really survive on gathering or hunting, and so corn and growing corn became their major, they were relying on it a lot. So sedentary and communal way of life changed ancestral Pueblo society forever. Within a generation, the average number of households in these settlements grew from, like earlier, it was like 1 to 3 people or families. Well, now it was 15 to 20 with average populations of like 200 people. So population density increased due to dozens of families occupying the same space. And this brought increased security against raids and encouraged greater cooperation amongst residents. So this just meant that now that they were all together in one place, they would start to protect it a little harder and get more security, but that also meant that they were kind of like a village, like a town a little bit, so now all the residents are working together. Just stuff like that. So this also facilitated trade and intermarriage between clans, and by the late 8th century, Mesa Verde's population was being augmented by settlers from the south. 4 different distinct cultural groups occupied the same villages, and large Pueblo I settlements laid claim to the resources found within 15 to 30 square miles around their areas. So they were typically organized in groups of at least 3 and spaced about 1 mile apart, and by 860 there were approximately 8,000 people living in Mesa Verde. So within the plazas of large villages, the Pueblo I people would dig massive pit structures of 800 square feet, and these became like central gathering places. However, despite the robust growth during the early and mid-9th century, unpredictable rainfall and periodic drought led to a dramatic reversal of settlement trends in the area. So many Pueblo I villages were abandoned less than like 40 years of being occupied. And by 880, Mesa Verde's population was in a steady decline, so people were starting to leave. So the beginning of the 10th century, that's when we saw like widespread depopulation of the region, so many people leaving. Many of them immigrated south of the San Juan River to what is called Chicao Canyon, and this was because they were looking for reliable rains for farming, considering that they weren't gathering or hunting and they were relying a lot on corn. So they were looking for more reliable rains so that they could grow their corn. So as Puebloans migrated south to where many of their ancestors had immigrated 200 years before, the influence of Chicao Canyon grew, and by 1950, Chicao had supplanted Mesa Verde as the region's cultural center. So thus, we get into Pueblo Era 2, which is 900 to 1150. I can say eras. I feel like I'm messing up these eras, but yeah. So Pueblo II period is marked by the growth and outreach of communities centered around the great houses of Chicao Canyon. So Puebloan retained a distinct cultural identity while melding regional innovation with ancient tradition. So this inspired further architectural advancements. So the 9th century Pueblos influenced 200 years of Chicoan great house construction. So they kind of combined how they were designing their structures. So they kept their original stuff and they just kind of added to it. So droughts during the late 9th century rendered ancestral Pueblo people's dry land farming unreliable, which led to their growing crops only near drainages for the next 150 years. So crop yields returned to healthy levels by the 11th century, and by 1050, the population of the area began to rebound. So they started to kind of, get back up there. So as agricultural prosperity increased, people immigrated to Mesa Verde from the south. So we had this thing where it was these plants were growing for a while, so everyone kind of left, and now that they're kind of back and everything's growing again, people are starting to come back. So Puebloan farmers increasingly relied on masonry reservoirs during the Pueblo era too, and during the 11th century they built check dams and terraces near drainages and slopes in an effort to conserve soil and runoff. So these fields offset the danger of crop failures in large dryland fields. So it was very easier to have more healthy crops than it was before. And by the mid-10th and early 11th centuries, proto-kivas had evolved into smaller circular structures called kivas, which were usually 12 to 15 feet across. So these Mesa Verde style kivasas included a feature from earlier times called I hope I pronounce this right, sipapu, which is a hole dug in the north of the chamber and symbolizes the ancestral Puebloans' place of emergence from the underworld. So at this time, ancestral Puebloan people began to move away from the post and mud jacal-style buildings that marked the Pueblo I period toward masonry construction, which have been utilized in the region since the 700s. But this was not widespread until the 11th and 12th century. So Farview House, which is one of the largest of these, guessing masonry constructed buildings, is considered a classic Chicao outlier on which construction likely began between 1750 to 1125, although some archaeologists believe that it was constructed as early as 1020. So the era's timber and earth unit pueblos were typically inhabited for about 20 years, and during the early 12th century, the focus of regional control shifted away from Chicao to Aztec, New Mexico, in the southern Mesa Verde region. And by 1150, drought had once again stressed the region's inhabitants, which led to another temporary cessation of great house construction at Mesa Verde. So a lot of what you're going to hear is that they'll kind of prosper for a bit and the population will grow, and then drought will occur and people will leave, which it makes sense. I mean, you don't want to stay in a place where there's constant drought, you can't get your plants to grow. It just makes sense. So it's a trend that usually happens. I mean, you don't really want to stay in an area where there's constant drought if you're trying to grow crops. But thus, 1150 leads to the end of the era of Pueblo II, and now we get into Pueblo III era. So Pueblo III era goes from 1150 to 1300, and it starts off with a severe drought. So a severe drought from 1130 to 1180 led to, as I mentioned before, a giant depopulation in many parts of the San Juan Basin, particularly at Chicao Canyon. So as the extensive Chicao system collapsed, people increasingly migrated to Mesa Verde, which caused major population growth in this area. This led much larger settlements of 600 to 800 people, which reduced mobility for Puebloan, who had in the past frequently relocated their dwellings and fields as part of their agricultural strategy. So now with all these people, with more than 800 people sometimes, their mobility was very reduced, so they kind of couldn't move around as much. So in order to sustain these very large populations, they dedicated more and more of their labor to farming than gathering or hunting or foraging. So they started to rely a lot more on farming yet again. So population increase also led to expanded tree felling that reduced habitat for many wild plant animal species that the Puebloan had relied on. Thus, this continued to deepen their dependence on the domesticated crops that they had at the time, although these crops are very susceptible, I can speak, to drought failure. So due to them like cutting away at these trees, they were taking away the habitat for some of the wild plants and animals that they also lived on, thus making them more dependent on a source that is easy to fail. So that's kind of, you can see that it's getting a little more difficult. So by the late 12th century, the system collapsed, and the amount of goods that were imported by the Mesa quickly declined, and Mesa Verde became isolated from the surrounding region. So by approximately 600 years, most Puebloan farmers had lived in small mesa-top homesteads, of which contained 1 or 2 families. They were typically located near their fields and walking distance to sources of like water. This practice would continue until like the late 12th century, and by the start of the 13th century, they began to live in canyon locations that were close to water sources and within walking distance of their fields. So as you can kind of see, they're now getting like closer to water sources and living at these water sources instead of relying on like rain. But yeah, so now they're starting to build closer to water sources. So structures built during this period have been described as, in quotes, among the world's greatest oh my god, I used to know how to pronounce this. It left me. Archaeological. What? Oh my god. How did I forget how to pronounce that? Archaeological treasures. So Pueblo 3 was masonry buildings. They were typically occupied for approximately 50 years. And these buildings more than doubled the usable lifespan of the Pueblo 2 structures. Agricultural innovations such as towers and multi-walled structures also appeared during this era. And Mesa Verde's population remained fairly stable during the 12th century drought. So, although droughts had pushed people away in the past centuries, during this century, it remained fairly stable. Not too many people left, not too many people entered. So it was usually just kind of stable. So, at the start of the 13th century, approximately 22,000 people lived there. The area saw moderate population increases during the following decades, and there were some very dramatic increases from 1,225 to 1,260. Most of the people in the region lived in the plains west of the mesa, such as locations which are your Yellow Jacket Pueblo, which is near Cortez, Colorado, other colonized canyon rims and slopes and multifamily structures that grew to unprecedented size as population swelled. But yeah, so by the 1,260, I know I'm pronouncing these wrong, but 1,260, the population, or the majority of Puebloans lived in large pueblos that housed several families and more than 100 people. The 13th century also saw 69 years of below average rainfall in the Mesa Verde region, and after 1,270, the area suffered from extremely cold weather. So, dendrochronology, if you don't know what that is, dendrochronology is when you take a tree, you cut it in half, and you count the rims to see how old it is. That's what it's called. So dendrochronology indicates that the last tree felled for construction on the mesa was cut in 1,281. That was the last tree cut for the Mesa Verde for construction. So there was major decline in ceramic imports to the region during this time, but local production remained steady. And despite challenging conditions, the Puebloans continued to farm the area until a very severe dry period, which happened from 1,276 to 1,299. This eventually ended 700 years of continuous human occupation on Mesa Verde. Archaeologists refer to this period as the Great Drought, and eventually that led to the last inhabitants of the mesa to leave the area a little bit before 1,285. And that is the last of the inhabitants. After that, there was I don't think any more until it got rediscovered in the later years. But those are the last inhabitants of those areas. So we're still on the topic of inhabitants, but now we're going to get into more specific subjects that I thought was pretty interesting and that was on there, and I was like, might as well give you guys all of the history while I'm at it. So we're going to get into the warfare of the inhabitants. So during the Pueblo III period, Puebloans built numerous stone masonry towers, and these would most likely serve as defense structures. They often incorporated hidden tunnels which connected the towers to associated cavasses. Warfare was conducted using the same tools that Puebloans used for hunting, which included bows, arrows, axes, clubs, spears. They would also craft hide and basket shields that were used during battle. And periodic warfare would occur throughout the 13th century. Civic leaders in the region likely attained power and prestige by distributing food during times of drought. So kind of like, helping the people to gain their trust, that kind of stuff. This system broke down, or it is believed it broke down during the Great Drought period, which led to intense warfare between competing clans. This would increasing economic and social uncertainty during the century's final decades, also led to very widespread conflict. Evidence of partly burned villages and post-mortem trauma have been uncovered, and the residents of one village appear to have been the victims of a site-wide massacre. Evidence of violence and cannibalism has been documented in the Mesa Verde region, and while most of the violence, which peaked during 1275 and 1285, during the time of the Great Drought, was generally ascribed to infighting amongst Puebloans, archaeological evidence found at San Canyon Pueblo in the canyons of the ancient national monument suggests that violent interactions also occurred between Puebloans and people from outside the region. So evidence of these attacks were discovered by members of the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, which happened during the 1990s. The assaults, which also occurred at the National Monument's Castle Rock Pueblo, were dated to be all the way back in 1280 and are considered to have effectively ended several centuries of Puebloan occupation at those sites. So many of the victims had shown signs of skull fractures, and the uniformity of the injuries suggested that they were most likely inflicted with a small stone axe. Others were scalped, dismembered, and cannibalized. The anthropology might have been undertaken as the anthropophagy, which I believe is cannibalism, could have been undertaken as a survival strategy during times of starvation. Definitely cannibalism. So I guess that is the scientific word for it. Anthropophagy. I believe. It's kind of spelled weird. I'm just trying to sound it out. But the archaeological records indicate that rather than being isolated to the Mesa Verde region, violent conflict was widespread in North America during the late 13th and 14th centuries and was likely exacerbated by global climate changes that negatively affected food supplies throughout the continent. So like areas getting colder or areas getting hotter, which is killing more crops than thought, and so leads to, droughts of food, which then leads to, fighting because there's not a lot of food, that kind of stuff. It's just due to global climate changes, due to the fact that our crop were not living as long. So now we get into another section. This one is called migration. So this is the migration of the inhabitants. So migration. So the Mesa Verde region saw unusual cold and dry conditions during the beginning of the 13th century, so around the time when the global climate change was happening. So this added population stress around the Mesa's environment, and then also strained the agricultural society that was already suffering from drought. The region's bimodal precipitation pattern, that's just rain, which brought rainfall during the spring and summer and snowfall during autumn and winter, began to fail post 1250. So after 1260, there was a very rapid depopulation of people from Mesa Verde, as, in quote, tens of thousands of people emigrated or died from starvation. So many smaller communities in the Four Corners region were also abandoned during this period, and the ancestral Puebloans had a very long history of migration in the face of environmental stability. But the depopulation of Mesa Verde at the end of the 13th century was different, because at the end of this, the region was almost completely emptied, and nobody ever returned to build permanent settlements. So, although they had a history of leaving, like we had talked about earlier, where someone would leave, someone would come back, during this time, during the 13th century, everyone left. Barely anybody was there, and then nobody came back. And so that is kind of why the Mesa Verde has a section of what is called rediscovery, because nobody came back really to, indicate that people were there. So, yeah. So while drought and resource depletion and overpopulation all contributed to the instability that they were facing during the last 2 centuries, their overdependence on maize crops, which is like your corn, was considered their fatal flaw of their subsistence strategy. They kind of, in a way, it makes sense. If you 100% depend on one thing, that can fail. If you 100% throw yourself onto like maize or crops that could easily fail, then it is very easy, if it stops raining, to have a complete like falling out, and you're gonna have to find something new, which is what it was considered, in quotes, their fatal flaw of their subsistence strategy, was relying heavily on their crops and their corn. So the vacating of ancestral Pueblo people left almost no direct evidence of their migration. However, they left behind their household goods, which would include your cooking utensils, your tools, your clothes, and this was able to give the archaeologists at the time the impression that the immigration, that them leaving, was haphazard or hurried. So it wasn't like they were like, okay, everyone pack up, it's time to go, we're going to be leaving in the next 3 days. It was more of, we gotta go now. Drop everything, pack what you think is essential, go. And that's basically what archaeologists believe happened. So, an estimated of 2,000 people lived in the region during the 13th century, and by the start of the 14th century, it was believed that the area was nearly uninhabited, that nobody was living there anymore. So, many of the surviving immigrants relocated to southern Arizona and New Mexico. And then, although the rate of settlement is unclear, increases in sparsely populated areas such as the Rio Cama, the Perito Plateau, the Santa Fe correspond directly with the period of migration from Mesa Verde. Many others relocated to the banks of the Little Colorado River, which was in western New Mexico and eastern Arizona. And while archaeologists tend to focus on the push factors, so what drove away the Puebloans from the region, there were also several different pull factors that would have made them leave and relocate. It wasn't just that they got pushed out, it was also that other areas looked better. So some of these pull factors were warmer temperatures, better farming conditions, more timber, better bison herds, and so this would incentivize them to relocate to the areas near the Rio Grande, and that is kind of what these factors were. So it isn't too wild to think that you would leave. I mean, if there's not enough factors to keep you in one area, but the other area has so many pull factors, wouldn't you just go? But yeah, so they did eventually leave, and they had multiple pull factors in why they left. So in addition to the numerous settlements along the Rio Grande, contemporary descendants of the Puebloans live in pueblos at Acoma, Zuni, Jemez, and Laguna. And that is the end of the migration section. Now we're into another section. This is going to be your organization. So although Chacao Canyon might have exerted regional control over Mesa Verde during the 11th and early 12th centuries, most archaeologists view the Mesa Verde region as a collection of smaller communities which were based on central sites and related outliers that were never fully integrated into a larger civic structure. So just like a ton of little towns that weren't necessarily all connected. So several ancient roads, which averaged 15 to 45 feet wide and lined with earthen beams, have been identified in the region and found. Most appear to connect communities and shrines, and others encircle great house sites. The extent of this road network is unclear, but no roads have ever been discovered leading to the Chicoan Great North Road or directly connecting Mesa Verde to any of the Chicoan sites. So, ancestral Puebloan shrines, which are called, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce this, herraduras? I'm so sorry. Have been identified near these road segments in the region. So these roads are unclear. Most of them are, the purpose is unclear, but several C-shaped herraduras have been excavated, and they are thought to have been directional shrines, which were used to indicate the location of great houses. And that's about it for all their organization. Now we get into their architecture, which is kind of like their buildings and their houses. So Mesa Verde is best known for a large number of well-preserved cliff dwellings. Many of these houses were built in alcoves or rock overhangs along canyon walls. These structures contained were mostly, blocks of hard sandstone and were held together with plastered with adobe mortar. In contrast to their very earlier constructions, and villages on top of the mesas, these cliff dwellings of the Mesa Verde reflected a region-wide trend towards the aggregation of growing regional populations into close, high defensible quarters during the 13th century. So unlike their older or earlier constructions, these ones were very much close and highly defensible. So these Puebloan buildings were built with stone. Windows usually faced the south, and they were usually in a U, E, or L shape. The buildings were located more closely together, which reflected deepening religious celebration. Towers were built near crevasses and likely used for lookouts. Pottery became more versatile, which would include pitchers, ladles, bowls, jars, dishware, anything like those kind of stuff for food or drinking. Water management and conservation techniques, these would include your reservoirs, your silt-retaining dams. They also emerged during this period. Styles for sandstone and mortar constructions, both surface and cliff dwellings, were usually T-shaped and had windows and doors. While most of the construction in these sites is consistent with common Pueblo agricultural forms, which would include your crevasses, towers, and pit houses, the space constrictions of these alcoves necessitated that what seems to have been a far denser concentration of their populations. Mug House, which is a typical cliff dwelling of the period, was home to around 100 people who shared 94 small rooms and 8 crevasses built against each other and sharing many of their walls. Builders in this area maximized space in any way they could, with no areas considered off limits to construction. And that's about as much as we know about their architecture. So now we get into a very interesting part that I was kind of interested in, which is their astronomy. So Puebloans used astronomical observations to plan their farming and religious ceremonies, drawing on both natural features in the landscape and masonry structures built for this purpose. Several great houses in the region were aligned to cardinal directions. This meant they were facing usually very important areas where the sun would pass and that kind of stuff. So they would position their windows and doors and walls to be along the path of the sun, and the sun's rays would indicate the passing of seasons. So Mesa Verde's Sun Temple is thought to have been an astronomical observatory. The temple is D-shaped, and its location and orientation indicate that its builders understood the cycles of both the sun and the moon. It is aligned to the major lunar standstill, which occurs every 18.6 years, and the sunset during the winter solstice, which can be viewed standing over the temple from a platform at the south end of Cliff Palace across Fewex Canyon. So at the bottom of the canyon is the Sun Temple fire pit, and Sun Temple is one of the largest exclusively ceremonial structures that was ever built by the ancestral Puebloans. I liked their astrology. It's very interesting that they knew about these, like cycles of the moon and the sun. I like the moon. I love the moon. If you don't know, I'm a sucker for the moon. Now we get into their agriculture and water control. So when conditions were good, 3 or 4 acres of land would provide enough food for a family of 3 or 4 individuals for 1 year, providing they were supplemented with game and wild plants. So they couldn't just 100% rely on their crops. It had to also have, been kind of mixed in with wild plants and game that was found around. So as Puebloans increasingly relied on corn, the success of their crops relied heavily into their lives. I mean, think about it. The more you rely on your corn, if that corn fails, that's going to hit a lot harder than if you've just a little bit relied on corn and then mainly relied on hunting and gathering. If your corn fails, that's going to hit a lot harder because that's your only resource. So most Puebloans practiced dry farming, which relied on rain to water the crops. And then others would utilize runoff, springs, seeps, and natural collection pools. Starting in the 9th century, they dug and maintained reservoirs that caught runoff from the summer showers and the spring snow melts, and then some of the crops were watered by hand. Archaeologists, there we go, believe that prior to the 13th century, springs and other sources of water were considered shared public resources. But then as the Puebloans moved into increasingly larger pueblos built near or around these water supplies, control was eventually private and limited to only members of the surrounding community. Between 750 to 800, Puebloans began constructing 2 large water containment structures in canyon bottoms. These would include your Moorfield and Box Elder reservoirs. And then eventually they would soon start to work on 2 more, which are considered the Farview and Sagebush reservoirs. These are approximately 90 feet across and are constructed on the mesa top. So the reservoirs lie on an east-west line that runs for approximately 6 miles. In 2004, the American Society of Civil Engineers designated these 4 reservoirs as National Civil Engineering Historic Landmarks, and in 2014, geospatial analysis suggested that neither collection nor retention of water was possible in the Farview Reservoir, and this interpretation views the structure as a more of a ceremonial place, with procession roads and an adaptation of Chicoan culture. So they found out that the Farview Reservoir could not even collect or retain water, and so they started to believe that maybe it was a ceremonial space. And that's about it for their agriculture and water control. Now we get into their hunting and foraging. Because they did do this before they started to rely more on corn, and they still kind of did it throughout the years, but corn started to become their staple. So they typically harvested more small game, but although sometimes they did organize larger hunting parties to go travel long distances, their main sources of food or animal protein came from mule deer, rabbits, bighorn sheep, antelope, and elk. They began to domesticate turkeys starting around 1000, and by the 13th century, consumption of the animal peaked, and that eventually supplanted deer as the primary protein source to many of the sites. Puebloans wove blankets from these turkey feathers and rabbit fur, and they made implements such as awls and needles from turkey and deer bones. Puebloans supplemented their diet by gathering the seeds and fruits of wild plants, searching large expanses of land while procuring these resources. Depending on the season, they would collect pine nuts, juniper berries, weedy goosefoot, pigweed, purslane, tomatillo, tansy mustard, globe mallow, sunflower seeds, and yucca, as well as different species of grass and cacti. So The wild seeds that they collected were cooked and ground up into porridge, and they would use sagebrush and mountain mahogany with peony and juniper for firewood. So, since most of the ancestral Puebloans considered all of the materials they consumed and discarded to be sacred, their midden piles, which are piles of like kind of like trash, so like bones, stuff like that, they were viewed with like reverence. And that's the end of the hunting and foraging. Now we get into their pottery. So specimens of shallow, unfired clay bowls, which were found at Canyon de Chelly, indicated that the innovation might have been derived from using clay bowls to parch seeds. Repeated uses of these bowls made them hard and impervious to water, which might represent the first fired pottery in the region. An alternate theory suggests that pottery originated in Mogollon Rim area to the south, where brown paste bowls were used during the first centuries of the Common Era. Others believe pottery was introduced to Mesa Verde from Mexico. However, there is no evidence of any ancient pottery markets in the region. However, archaeologists believe that local potters exchanged decorative wares between families. So the Mesa Verde's black on white pottery was produced at 3 different locations. These were Sand Canyon, Castle Rock, and Mesa Verde. So archaeological evidence indicates that nearly every household had at least one member who worked as a potter. Trench kilns were constructed away from the pueblos and closer to sources of firewood. These designs were added to ceramic vessels. They were added with like yucca leaf brushes and paints made from minerals such as iron, manganese, I believe, bee plant, and tansy mustard. Most of the pottery that had been found in the 9th century pueblos were sized for individuals or small families, but communal ceremonialism expanded during the 13th century, which started to make much larger feast-sized vessels. Corrugated decorations appeared on the Mesa Verde gray wares after 700, and by 1000, entire vessels were crafted in this way. The technique created a rough exterior surface that was easier to hold onto than regular gray wares, which were smooth. Under normal conditions, pots made of mancos shell turned gray when fired, and those made of Morrison Formation clay turned white. Clays from southeastern Utah turned red when fired in a high oxygen environment. Rock arts and murals is the next section. So rock art is found throughout the Mesa Verde region, but its dispersion is uneven and periodic. So it doesn't happen over time, it just kind of happens here and there. So some locations have numerous examples, while others have none. And some periods saw prolific creation, while others saw very little. Some styles also vary differently over time. Common motifs, however, in the rock art of the region include your anthropomorphic figures in procession and during copulation or childbirth, handprints, animal and people tracks, wavy lines, spirals, concentric circles, animals, and hunting scenes. As the region's populations plummeted during the late 13th century, the subject of Puebloan rock art increasingly shifted to depictions of your shields, warriors, and battle scenes, because during this time, they were fighting a lot more. Starting during the late Pueblo II period and continuing through Pueblo III, the ancestral Pueblos of the Mesa Verde region created plaster murals in their great houses, particularly in their cavazas. These murals contained both painted and inscribed images depicting your animals, your people, and designs that were used in textiles and pottery, which dated as far back as the Basket Maker III era. Others tend to depict triangles and mounds. These were thought to represent your mountains and your hills that surrounded the area. Murals were typically located on the face of the kiva bench and usually encircled the room. The painted murals included the colors of red, green, yellow, white, brown, and blue, and the designs were still used by the Hopi during the 15th and 16th centuries. And that is it for all of our inhabitants' history. Now we're going to get more into the park and its climate, its geology, ecology, that kind of stuff. So now we're actually starting to get into the park, but before was kind of our history. So now we kind of know how this park got here, what it's known for, how the cliff dwellings were made, that kind of stuff. So now we can kind of get into more of getting the national park set. So the climate. Mesa Verde is considered a humid continental climate. The region's range is bimodal, meaning that they get their rain through summer rains, winter snow, and seeps and springs in or around Mesa Verde villages. Middle mesa areas are typically cooler than the top of the mesa, and the cliff dwellings, which were built to take advantage of the solar energy. The angle of the sun in the winter warmed the cliff dwellings, and the air was usually 10 to 20 degrees warmer than the top of the mesa during winter. However, in the summer, since the sun would change locations and it was more overhead, the villages were protected from the sunlight by the cliff dwellings. So during the winter, they would warm up, and then during the summer, they would actually cool down. So that was really cool. Now we get into what is called anthropogenic ecology and geology. This just means that the human impact on animals and plants in the ecosystem. So analysis of rat midden indicates, so midden yet again is kind of like heaps of trash, if you think about it, probably like poop, that kind of stuff. With the exception of invasive species such as tumbleweed and clover, that the flora and fauna in the area have remained relatively consistent for the past 4,000 years. Nothing has really changed. So the Mesa Verde's canyons were created by streams that eroded the hard sandstone that covers the area. This results in the Mesa Verde National Park elevations to range from 6,000 to 8,572 feet. The highest elevation that you can go to in the park in general, is at what is considered Park Point. The terrain in the park is now a transition zone between the low desert plateaus and the Rocky Mountains. And that's it for the anthropogenic ecology and geology. Now we're just going to get into the geology, which is what we know now. So, although the area's first Spanish explorers named the feature Mesa Verde, the term is a misnomer because true mesas are perfectly flat, while Mesa Verde is not. So it's not technically considered a mesa. Because it is slanted to the south, the proper geological term is a cuesta, not a mesa. So Mesa Verde's slants contribute to the formation of the alcoves that have preserved the area's cliff dwellings. The beds of the Mancos Shale are fine-grained sandstones, mudstones, and shales, which accumulated in the deep water of the Cretaceous Sea. The area has a high clay content, which causes it to expand when wet, leading to sliding of the terrain. There are 3 formations in the Mesa Verde group, which reflect the changes in the depositional environment in the area over time. The first is the Point Lookout sandstone, which is named for, obviously, the Point Lookout feature in the park, and is also, could you guess it, sandstone. The next is the Menifee formation, which is the middle formation, whose content usually features interbedded carbonaceous shales, siltstones, and sandstones. And then finally, the Cliff House sandstone is the area's youngest rock layer. That usually contains numerous fossil beds of different types, such as shells, fish teeth, and other invertebrate leftovers from the receding sea. Continuing throughout the Cretaceous period and into the early Tertiary, there was uplifting in the area of the Colorado Plateau. I believe we heard about this in Bryce Canyon. I believe we heard about that one in Bryce Canyon. So this happened with the San Juan Mountains and the La Plata Mountains, which led to the formation of the Mesa Verde pediment with the help of erosion. Later in the Tertiary, the last period of uplift and rock tilting towards the south caused these streams to cut rapidly into the rock, removing loose sediment and forming the canyons we see today. So since this caused the isolation of the Mesa Verde pediment from the surrounding rock, and today, since the climate is more arid, these erosional processes are they're slowed. They're not as fast as what happened back then. And that's about it for all the geology. Now we get into the rediscovery of the era. As I said earlier, the inhabitants before left during 1290, I believe they were already gone. So this place was left for a while. So rediscovery does happen. Mexican-Spanish missionaries and explorers Francisco Atanasio Dominica, I'm pronouncing these names so wrong, I'm sorry, and Silvestre Velez de Escalante, seeking a route from Santa Fe to California, faithfully recorded their travels in 1776. So they reached the Mesa Verde region, which they named after its high tree-covered plateaus. However, they never actually got close enough or into the angle that they needed to actually see these ancient stone villages that we know exist there today. So they were the first Europeans to travel the route through much of the Colorado Plateau into Utah and back through Arizona to New Mexico. The Mesa Verde region has long been occupied by the Utes, and in 1868, a treaty between them and the United States government recognized the Ute ownership of all Colorado land west of the Continental Divide. After there had become an interest in land in western Colorado, however, a new treaty in 1873 left the Ute with a strip of land in southwestern Colorado between the border with New Mexico and 15 miles north, the Mesa Verde region. So the Ute wintered in the warm, deep canyons and found sanctuary there in the high plateaus of Mesa Verde. Believing the cliff dwellings to be sacred ancestral sites, they never did live there, though. Because they believed that it was sacred, and so they did not live in any of the ancient dwellings. However, they did live around the Mesa Verde at the time. John Moss eventually would start making his observations known in 1873. The following year, Moss led eminent photographer William Henry Jackson through Mancos Canyon at the base of the Mesa Verde. Reports by both Jackson and Holmes were included in the 1876 report of the Hayden Survey, which is one of the 4 federally financed efforts to explore the American West. These and other publications led to the proposals to systematically study southwestern archaeological sites. Eventually, there was a person who wanted to find ancestral Puebloan settlements. Her name was Virginia McClurg, I believe. She was a journalist for the New York Daily Graphic. She ended up visiting Mesa Verde in 1882 and 1885, and that is where her party discovered Echo Cliff House, 3-tier house, and balcony house in 1885, and these would eventually inspire her to start protecting the dwellings and artifacts. Now we get into another person who helped with the rediscovery and also helped, eventually get the land to be a national park, which is called Wethrels. So a family of cattle ranchers, which are called the Wethrels, befriended members of the Ute tribe near their ranch southwest of Mancos, Colorado. With the Ute tribe's approval, the Wethrels were allowed to bring cattle into the lower, warmer plateaus of the present Ute reservation during winter. On December 18th, 1888, Richard Wethrell and cowboy Charlie Manson rediscovered Cliff Palace after spotting the ruins from the top of the Mesa Verde. Richard Wethrell, families and friends, explored the ruins and gathered artifacts, some of which they eventually sold to the Historical Society of Colorado, but they tended to keep much of what they actually found. Photographer Frederick H. Chapman visited the region in 1889 and 1890, and he described the landscape and ruins in a book called The Land of the Cliff Dwellers, and then in that book he illustrated with hand-drawn maps and photographs of, the cliff dwellings. Another person that is well known in helping the rediscovery and also with protecting, getting this park ready and bringing attention to it was Gustav Nordenskjold, I believe. So the Wethrels hosted Gustav, who was a son of polar explorer Adolf Erik Nordskjold, in 1891. Gustav was a trained mineralogist who introduced scientific methods to artifact collection. He recorded locations, photographed extensively. He diagrammed the sites, and he correlated what he observed with existing archaeological literature, as well as talking to the homegrown expertise of the Wethrels. He removed many of the artifacts that he found, and he would eventually send them to Sweden, where they would eventually go to the National Museum of Finland. Gustav eventually published in 1893 the book called The Cliff Dwellers of the Mesa Verde. And when Gustav shipped the collection that he had of Mesa Verde artifacts, he actually initiated the concerns about the need to protect Mesa Verde as land and its resources. So due to the fact that when I said that, yeah, he helped protect the park, I didn't say it was a good way. Due to the fact that he shipped a lot of artifacts out of the park, started to raise concerns with people on, shoot, maybe we need to protect this area and its resources and its land, because if a lot of people are taking artifacts and keeping them to themselves and selling them and that stuff, we need to protect it. And so thus we get into the section of the national park itself. In 1889, Goodman Point Pueblo became the first pre-Columbian archaeological site in the Mesa Verde region to gain federal protection. However, it was also the first site to be protected in the United States, period. Virginia McClurg, the lady we talked about earlier, was very diligent in her efforts between 1887 and 1906 to inform the U.S. and European community of the importance of protecting the important historical materials and dwellings in said Mesa Verde. Her efforts would include enlisting support from 250,000 women. 250,000 women she employed or enlisted to help support this park. So she employed these women through the Federation of Women's Club, eventually writing and having published poems in popular magazines, giving speeches domestically and internationally, and eventually forming the Colorado Cliff Dwellers Association. So the Colorado Cliff Dwellers' purpose was to protect the resources of Colorado cliff dwellings, eventually reclaiming as much of the original artifacts as possible and sharing information about the people who dwelt there. Lucy Peabody, who was located in Washington, D.C., met with members of Congress to further the cause. Former Mesa Verde National Park Superintendent Robert Hyder communicated his belief that the park might have been far more significant with the hundreds of artifacts taken by Nord's Gold. So he basically is stating that if they had not allowed Gustav to have taken those artifacts, then Mesa Verde would have been far more significant due to the fact that it would have had all these hundreds of artifacts. However, Gustav had sent them over to the National Museum of Finland. So I don't know if we'll ever get those artifacts back, although I feel like we should. I don't know. I feel like if an artifact is from a certain place, then it should stay in that place and be displayed around that place. I don't think it should move around because, I don't know. Artifacts are important. Artifacts should stay around the region that they're found at. But that's just my opinion. Anyways, by the end of the 19th century, it was clear that the Mesa Verde had needed protection from people in general who came to Mesa Verde and created or sold their own collection of artifacts. So basically stating that, hey, now we're finally realizing by the end of the 19th century that, shoot, we need to start protecting this area from people who are coming in, creating their own collections of artifacts, or finding their own collections of artifacts and selling them. So eventually, in a report to the Secretary of the Interior, Smithsonian Institution ethnologist Jesse Walter Fewix described vandalism at Mesa Verde's Cliff Palace. I'm going to read you this because I thought, you know what, it'll be important. Let's learn it together. So, in quotes, this is from Jesse Walter Fewix. Parties of Kiro seekers camped on the ruins for several winters, and it is reported that many hundred specimens there have been carried down the mesa and sold to private individuals. Some of these objects are now in museums, but many are forever lost to science. In order to secure this valuable archaeological material, walls were broken down, often simply to let light into the darker rooms. Floors were invariably opened and buried crevasses mutilated. To facilitate this work and get rid of the dust, great openings were broken through the 5 walls which formed the front of the ruin. Beams were used for firewood to so great an extent that not a single roof now remains. This work of destruction, added to that resulting from erosion due to rain, left Cliff Palace in a sad condition. In very simple words, people went in to Cliff Palace, broke down many walls, tore off the roofs to use as firewood, and left it like that. And so it has been kind of mutilated to an extent. Many of the artifacts that were found at Mesa Verde are now located, as stated, in museums or private collections in the US or across the world. A representative selection of pottery vessels and other objects, for example, is now in the British Museum in London. No surprise there! And the British love everything. Good God. I wasn't surprised when I read that, in all honesty. I was like, oh, not surprised. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt approved the creation of the Mesa Verde National Park and the Federal Antiques Act of 1906. The park was an effort to, in quotes, preserve the works of man, and was the first park created to protect a location of cultural significance. In 1976, 8,500 acres was designated a wilderness area. These 3 small and separate sections of the national park are located on the steep north and east boundaries and serve as buffers to protect the significant Native American sites. And unlike most wilderness areas, visitor access to Mesa Verde Wilderness is prohibited, along with the rest of the park's backcountry. You cannot go there. You can't. It's not allowed. So you can't go into the wilderness. We will get into the excavation and protection category. So between 1908 and 1922, Spruce Tree House, Cliff Palace, and Sun Temple ruins were stabilized. Most of these early efforts were led by Jesse Walter Fewix, and during the 1930s and 40s, the Civilian Conservation Corps appears again. They are fucking everywhere, dude. They started in 1932, and they played key roles in excavation efforts, building trails and roads, creating museum exhibits, and constructing buildings at Mesa Verde. From 1958 to 1965, Wetherill Mesa Archaeological Project included archaeological excavations, stabilization of sites, and surveys. With excavation and study of the 11 Wetherill Mesa sites, it is considered the largest archaeological effort in the United States. The project oversaw the excavation of what is considered the Longhouse and Mug House, and in 1966, as with all historical areas administered by the National Park Service, Mesa Verde was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and in 1987, the Mesa Verde Administrative District was listed on the register. So it was designated a World Heritage Site in 1978, and in its 2015 Travel Awards, Sunset Magazine named Mesa Verde National Park, in quotes, the best cultural attraction in the western United States. So in it, we also get into the section of conflicts with local tribes. So conflicts over who laid claim to the land surrounding the ruins came to fruition in 1911, when the United States government wanted to secure more land for the park that was owned by the Ute Native Americans. The Utes were reluctant to agree to the land swap proposed by the government, noting that the land they were seeking was the best land the tribe owned. Frederick Abbott, working with Native American office official James McLaughlin, proclaimed to be an ally to the Ute in negotiations. Abbott later claimed that the, quote, government was stronger than the Utes, saying that when the government finds, in quotes, old ruins on land that it wants to take for public purposes, it has the right to take it. Feeling that they were left with no other options, the Utes reluctantly agreed to trade the 10,000 acres on Chapin Mesa for 19,500 acres on Ute Mountain. The Utes continued to battle the Bureau of Native American Affairs to prevent more Ute land from being incorporated into the park, and Superintendent Jesse L. Nussbaum later confessed that the Ute Mountain land traded for Chapin Mesa in 1911 belonged to the tribe anyway, meaning the government had traded land that never belonged to them in the first place. In the 1920s, the park began offering, in quotes, I'm going to say this, Native American ceremony performances that gained popularity among visiting tourists. However, these ceremonies did not actually reflect the rights of the ancient Puebloans who lived in the cliff dwellings, nor the rights of the modern Ute. So they were completely wrong. It was all fake. Navajo Day laborers performed these rituals, resulting in, quote, the wrong Native Americans doing the wrong dance on the wrong land, end quote. In addition to the inaccuracies of these ceremonies, a question of whether the Navajo dancers were being paid a question of whether the Navajo dancers were paid fairly also resulted in questions regarding the lack of local Native Americans being employed in other capacities in the park. Additionally, the park offered very little financial benefits to the Ute Mountain Ute despite their land swap, making much of the park possible. So yeah, it's not really conflicts with local tribes, it's more like the United States is going to just take the fucking land. That's really what it is. I mean, shoot, they traded land that they didn't even have. Anyways, now I get into the services of the park. So, the entrance of Mesa Verde National Park is on the U.S. Route 160, which is approximately 9 miles east of the community of Cortez and 7 miles west of Mancos, Colorado. The park covers 52,485 acres, and it contains 4,372 documented sites, which include the 600 cliff dwellings. It is considered the largest archaeological preserve in the U.S., and it protects some of the most important and best preserved archaeological sites in the country. The park initiated the Archaeological Site Conservation Program in 1995, and it analyzes data pertaining to how sites are constructed and utilized. The Mesa Verde Visitor and Research Center is located just off of Highway 160 and is before the park entrance booths. Chapin Mesa is 20 miles beyond the Visitor Center. Mesa Verde National Park is an area of federal exclusive jurisdiction, and because of all this, law enforcement, emergency medical service, and wildland structural fire duties are conducted by federal National Park Service law enforcement rangers, and access to the park facilities vary by the season. 3 of the different cliff dwellings on Chapin Mesa are open to the public. Spruce Tree House is open all year long, while the weather permits. Balcony House, Longhouse, and Cliff Palace require tour tickets for range-guided tours, and many other dwellings are visible from the road but are not open to tourists. So the park offers hiking trails, a campground, and during very peak seasons, facilities for food, fuel, and lodging. However, most of these are unavailable in the winter. The park's early administration buildings, located on Chapin Mesa, form an architecturally, that's a really weird word, significant complex of buildings. So, built in the 1920s, the Mesa Verde Administrative Complex was one of the first examples of the Park Service using culturally appropriate design in the development of park facilities, and this area was eventually designated a National Historic Landmark District in 1987. Eventually, you get into wildfires and modified trees. So, during the years of 1996 to 2003, the park suffered from several different wildfires. So these fires, many of which were started by lightning during times of drought, burned 28,340 acres of forest, which is more than half of the park. These fires damaged many of the archaeological sites and park buildings, and the fires were named Chapin V, 1996, Birch and Pony, which happened in 2000, Long Mesa, which happened in 2002, and the Balcony House Complex fires, which happened in 2003. These were 5 different fires that began on the same day. Yay. The Chapin V and Pony fires destroyed 2 rock art sites, and the Long Mesa fire nearly destroyed the museum, the first one ever built in the National Park System, and Spruce Tree House, the 3rd largest cliff dwelling in the park. Dense undergrowth and tree coverage kept many ancient sites hidden from view, but after these fires, 593 previously undiscovered sites were revealed, most of them which dated back to the Basket Maker 3 era and the Pueblo 1 periods. Also uncovered during this time and during the fires were extensive water containment features, which included 1,189 check dams, 344 terraces, and 5 reservoirs that date to the Pueblo 2 era and 3 periods. In 2008 of February, the Colorado Historical Society decided to invest a part of its $7 million budget into a culturally modified trees project in the national park. Another thing I wanted to talk about and what we're also going to get into, is the Ute Mountain Tribal Park. So the Ute Mountain Tribal Park, which adjoins the Mesa Verde National Park to the east of the mountains, is approximately 125,000 acres along the Mancos River. Hundreds of surface sites, cliff dwellings, petroglyphs, and wall paintings of ancestral Puebloan and Ute cultures are preserved in the park. Native American Ute tour guides provide background information about the people, culture, and history of the parklands. And National Geographic Traveler chose it as one of the, quote, 80 world destinations for travel in the 21st century, end quote, and one of the only 9 places selected in the United States. Key sites of this area include the addition to the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. They also boast a number of mesa top ruins. These are, the ones open to the public are your Farview Complex, Cedar Tree Tower on Chapin Mesa, and Badger House Community on Weatherill Mesa. And we're going to get a little bit into each of those. So Balcony House is set on a high ledge facing east. It's 45 rooms and 2 kivas, which would have been cold during the winter. Visitors on range-guided tours enter by climbing a 32-foot ladder and crawling through a small 12-foot tunnel. You'll never catch me there. No. Oh, that sounds so... Oh my god. I might have claustrophobia. That sounds awful. The exit, which is a series of toe holds in the cleft of the cliff, was believed to be the only entry and exit route for the cliff dwellers, which made the small village very easy to defend and secure. One of these logs in the area, in this cliff dwelling, was dated to 1278, so it was likely built not long before the Mesa Verde people left the area. It was eventually excavated in 1910 by Jesse L. Nussbaum, who was the first National Park Service archaeologist and one of the first superintendents of Mesa Verde National Park. Visitors can enter Balcony House only through a range-guided tour, which involves numerous ladders up the cliff face and crawling through a small tunnel. No. I'll go home. Thank you. Cliff Palace is another place you can visit. This is a multi-storied ruin, the best-known cliff dwelling in Mesa Verde, and is located in the largest alcove in the center of the Great Mesa. It was south and southwest facing, providing greater warmth from the sun in the winter, and dating back more than 700 years. The dwelling is constructed of sandstone, wooden beams, and mortar. Cliff Palace was home to approximately 125 people, but was likely an important part of a larger community of 60 nearby pueblos, which housed a combined 600 or more people. With 23 cavasas and 150 rooms, Cliff Palace is the largest cliff dwelling in Mesa Verde National Park. Another place you can visit is Longhouse, which is located on the Weatherill Mesa. Longhouse is the second largest Puebloan village, which is approximately housed 150 people. The location was excavated from 1959 through 1961 as a part of the Weatherill Mesa Archaeological Project. It is believed the Longhouse was built prior to 1200, and it was occupied until 1280. I'm having a lisp a little bit. The cliff dwelling features 150 rooms, 1 kiva, 1 tower, and a central plaza. Its rooms are not clustered like the typical cliff dwellings. Stones were used without shaping for fit and stability. 2 overhead ledges contain storage space for grain, and 1 ledge seems to include an overlook with small holes in the wall to see the rest of the village below. And a spring is accessible within several hundred feet, and seeps are located in the rear of the village. On to the last places you can visit. You can visit Mug, Oak Tree, Spruce Tree, and Square Tower houses. Mug House is located on Weatherill Mesa. It contains 94 rooms, a large kiva, and a nearby reservoir. It received its names from 4 mugs of the Charles Mason and the Weatherill brothers found strung together at the site. Oak Tree House and neighboring Fire Temple can be visited via a 2-hour ranger-guided hike. Spruce Tree House is the 3rd largest village within several hundred feet of a spring and has 130 rooms and 8 kivas. It was constructed between 1211 and 1278, and it is believed that somewhere between 60 to 80 people lived there. The short trail to Spruce Tree House begins at the Chapin Mesa Archaeological Museum, and the Square Tower House is one of the stops in the Mesa Top Loop Road driving tour. And that tower is the largest or the tallest structure in Mesa Verde. And we are done. That is all you have to know about Mesa Verde. All I could find about Mesa Verde that I thought was important. And I am tired. Oh, I think that was longer than Yellowstone. I don't have a plan yet for my next 2 parks that we'll be covering. But they will be pre-recorded because I will be gone during that time. So they will come out hopefully around the same time. Well, it'll come out Tuesday and then it'll come out Saturday. But yeah, so I will see you guys then. Thank you guys so much for listening to me talk about Mesa Verde. And I hope I got it right. I hope you guys enjoyed. I believe I covered everything that I thought was important and I wanted to cover. And I will see you guys next time. But, as always, until our next adventure, may your trails be filled with wanderlust. And I will see y'all in the parks. Alright. Goodbye.